Welcome to our conversation with Jessica Bennett, first gender editor of the New York Times. Jessica writes about gender, culture, and sexuality. She has worked for Newsweek and Time magazines and is the author of the best-selling book, The Feminist Fight Club, a survival manual for a sexy workplace. And she created recently, This is 18, a celebration of girlhood around the world. Hi, Jess, how are you?
Good. I'm good. How are you?
Fine. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You always say you invented your job, and this was a position that didn't exist before. How come? How was the process?
Oh, well, it dates back to 2016. I think a lot of people thought that the creation of the position was actually in response to the election of President Trump. And it wasn't. I had been covering gender issues for a number of years for the Times as a freelancer. And so I went in and I pitched this idea of creating a position specifically to cover gender. And so by the time I actually started the job, it was 2017, October, and the Me Too movement had just erupted. So it felt incredibly timely. And the mission of the job was essentially to better cover stories about women, about LGBTQ individuals, about men as it pertains to gender, and also to better engage women readers. It was there was a business imperative as well as a journalistic imperative. And on the business side we knew at the Times, based on surveys, that we had a larger subscription base who was male. And we knew that those who engaged with our content online and those who left comments on stories and shared on social media, they were more frequently men. And so we wanted to bridge that gap.
Well, we have a few gender editors here in Argentina. What are the resources we as women journalists should use to convince our employers of the need of a gender editor?
Good question. I tried to make the case through numbers in some ways that this was an important role. It was a role that wasn't just the moral thing to do or the right thing to do, but there was also a business case to be made for why. And that, if news organizations were not reaching 51% of the population, they were not going to survive. And so I tried to kind of combine these things to make a case for why this position should be created and why they should hire me. But I guess my advice would be to not, in addition to wanting to cover the stories and elevating and identifying things that are not currently being covered or things that are not being covered in a way that they should be, really making a business case for it. Because at the end of the day, journalistic institutions are still businesses. They have to make money to survive. My role as gender editor didn't have one mandate. And if the idea was to better engage women readers, there were a million ways that we could do that. And we weren't even sure what would be most effective. So one of the things we tried to do was create new mediums for content consumption. So we launched a newsletter called In Her Words, devoted to amplifying women's voices. And some of that was a curation of stories that already existed in the newspaper, but it's a big newspaper. People don't see everything that's published, including me. And we knew that women were more likely to want to consume something in their inbox. We knew that the times they would be opening a newsletter might be different than the general population. And so we tried to tailor it that way. And we created all sorts of projects that we thought could both elevate what we were doing, but also expose different voices. So you mentioned This is 18 in my bio. This was a project where we commissioned teen girl photographers to document teen girls in 21 different countries around the world. And the idea was to show what life is like for an 18-year-old in different places. And the thinking behind that was that, so often the stories of girls are minimized in the media, or they are sort of talked down to. And so in addition to documenting these stories, we did something that was pretty different for the New York Times, which was not hiring professional photojournalists to do the documenting, but actually finding these teen girls in their locations and pairing them with a mentor, and then allowing them to go inside the homes of these other teen girls. And I think they got a lot more access as a result of that. It was teens talking to teens. And we wanted to reach young women specifically in every possible medium we could think of.
How can we achieve a gender perspective across all sections and coverages of the media? For example, sports, let's say.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When I was starting my job, we had a big discussion about, okay, do we want to create a new section of the newspaper for gender coverage? And we really felt like that was not the right approach because, like you said, gender needs to be a lens on every aspect of what we do. So it's not so much as putting stories in their own new section, it's having someone who thinks about gender issues who covers sports, and recognizing that gender is a story within business and within politics and within all these different areas. And some of it is just a little bit of a shift in thinking about how we approach the stories we're already covering. And so I would always joke that, yes, I was the gender editor, but actually there were unofficial gender editors on every desk inside the newsroom who were thinking this way and assigning stories and noticing when things would happen and thinking about not just the ways that the coverage was happening, but who was being quoted in the stories and how did the stories look on the printed page, who was in the forefront of the photos, and how are they depicting women politicians or whatever it might be. But there's also these really subtle, tiny things like who are the experts that you're reaching out to, and are they typically men, and how language, sometimes tiny bits of language, makes its way into headlines.
What are the gender stories that haven't been told yet?
Oh my gosh. I think we're actually doing it. It's been really interesting to see over the past few years, the way that stories of women and stories of transgender people and stories of the LGBTQ community, and now stories that are not just about gender, but the intersection of race and gender, have made their way into the mainstream coverage. And it was interesting back in 2017 when the Me Too movement began to sort of look at that and wonder what was going to happen in the months ahead. Would this continue to be covered? Would it become global? Would it become a global movement? Here's my dog's coming to say hello. This is Charlie. Hi. He's a feminist. Would we continue talking not just about the problem, but about solutions? And I would always sort of joke that, we shouldn't have to have a gender editor. This is not a job that should actually exist. We should naturally be covering these things. And so we will know we've been successful when this job no longer needs to exist. But I think that the culture has in fact changed so much in the last couple of years, in part sparked by the Me Too movement, which, by the way, was reported by and uncovered by women journalists. So I've actually been really encouraged by the way that we've seen a lot of the mainstream institutions better covering these issues. And like you said, appointing people in positions of power, either to cover gender issues or to act as a kind of public editor or ombudswoman, ombudsperson, to make sure we're doing it well, or at least better. And so there will always be stories that we're not covering, but I actually think we're doing a pretty good job.
We have a serious problem here in Argentina with femicides. More than 200 cases this year so far. How can we from the media avoid fatigue of the audiences, call their attention without being sensationalist?
It's such an interesting question because it's a problem that continues to exist and you have to report on it, but how do you prevent your readers and your audience from getting tired of reading about it? I'm not sure I know the answer, but I know that I thought about this a lot when we were covering Me Too, because the New York Times broke the story of Harvey Weinstein in Hollywood, and that sort of had this ripple effect globally, and everyone created their own hashtag Me Too in different languages. And I kept the cynical journalist in me kept looking at my watch to be like, okay, this is great, but like, how long is this going to last? Like, how long till this news cycle ends, until people get tired of this, until it starts to feel redundant and people stop caring? And to my surprise, I think they didn't stop caring. It was as if this dam had been broken, and I think this pent up anger and feeling among women that they had not been heard or listened to or believed in the past, caused people to maintain interest. And I think this is a problem where, do you give your audience what they want, or do you decide that it's important and you're going to just try new ways to get them to read the coverage? I think as journalists, we have to make the decision that it's important, and we are going to keep reporting on it and hope that people care.
Jessica, can we cover gender with humor?
I hope so. We're not in a very humorous time right now. I've always seen humor as a way to open up subjects that people are uncomfortable talking about. And I think, feminism and gender issues are one of these, and especially for men. I think that there is sometimes the assumption that those of us writing about it are on the attack, and that they need to be defensive. And so in my own writing and in my book, what I tried to do was use humor as a way to open up the subject and say, like, it's okay to laugh about this. It's also okay to not know the right answer and to get it wrong. Really, all we need is some sort of willingness to want to do better, and acknowledging that, like, I'm not perfect either. We are all a little bit sexist, women too, and that's okay. Once you recognize it, you can correct for it.
What are the more subtle violences we women have to face? For example, what is an interrupter?
In my book, I tried to give names, sort of funny names, to these behaviors that are very common, behaviors to describe the kind of subtle sexism that still plays out very frequently inside workplaces. So we know that women, when they speak, are twice as likely to be interrupted as men are. I have not figured out how this plays out on Zoom yet, so I call this manterruptions. Obviously, I just said women do it too, so it's not just men, but I tried to combine words to make new words to try to pinpoint these specific behaviors that most of us have experienced, but probably weren't exactly sure how to identify or call out. And then I tried to provide strategies for what to do if this is happening, some of which are very obvious seeming, such as someone else jumping in to say, hey, can you let Jessica finish? I wanted to hear what she had to say.
Jessica, one of the most difficult debates or obstacles we as women journalists face when we have to cover sexual assault cases is the question of consent and the credibility of the victim. We all say, we feminists say, I believe you, sister, but do male editors believe? Can you tell us how to encourage women to speak up when the accused is, let's say, the President of the United States, as in the E. Jean Carroll case?
Right. Well, this, of course, is the irony of all ironies. You know, no matter how much we talk about how the culture has shifted, at least in this country, we have a person running the country who's been credibly accused by multiple people. And we have seen many of those people, including E. Jean Carroll, you know, be questioned and undermined and their credibility called into question. And I think a lot of women are coming from a place where they have traditionally been doubted. That was the default. And so the idea that we're talking about believing women is good. But the role of the journalist has been to corroborate these stories, to find the paper trail, to find the financial receipts, to talk to anyone that these people had previously told, to find, you know, 3 sources who can corroborate a story for every person that's speaking up. And if they can't, to find some other way of showing that it happened, a diary, a change in behavior, talking to past therapists, like really digging back to corroborate stories so that there cannot be a shred of doubt. With Harvey Weinstein, for example, the story that sort of opened the floodgates, the way that was covered by my colleagues, Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, was so straight. There was not a shred of opinion. There wasn't a perspective. They didn't have a point of view. It was just fact after fact after fact. And these facts were not relying entirely on the woman's voice. It is important to believe women, to not necessarily doubt them off the bat, but for every single woman who spoke up, they had a paper trail or some other record. And so when that story came out, there was no shred of doubt. People couldn't try to poke holes in it, or they couldn't say that the reporters who had uncovered it had some sort of agenda.
Is it possible to sue a media company for gender discrimination? Tell us about the Newsweek case.
Yeah, so I didn't begin my career wanting to cover gender issues. I didn't study women's studies in school. Like, my parents never used the words feminist. So I really had a crash course education that began when I was a young junior reporter at Newsweek magazine in the early 2000s, and feeling, along with my young female colleagues, that we were really stuck. We weren't getting ahead. Our male colleagues were rising up more quickly than us. We learned that they were making more money than us, like all of these things. And we learned that 40 years before we were there, in the year 1970, the women of Newsweek had actually sued the company for gender discrimination in what at the time was the first lawsuit of its kind. These women, there were 46 of them, and they were told when they began their jobs at Newsweek magazine that women don't write here. You can be a researcher, you can, you know, push the coffee cart, but we do not allow women to write. And it was okay in that era for the members of HR or the bosses to say that explicitly. And so they sued and they got a lawyer and they ultimately settled, but that story paved the way for female journalists like myself. And it was through learning the story of those women who were called dollies by their male bosses because they were just like little playthings, that really made me realize that this was a subject I wanted to focus on. And they were the first, but they have not been the last. There have been lawsuits at all sorts of different institutions, and recently at the BBC over pay disparities. So I think that people are, in fact, using the legal system to try to correct for some of these things.
Well, we are going to wrap up this conversation with Jessica, asking her to give us the best piece of advice she can for gender editors around the world.
Honestly, I would say trust your instincts. Like most of the stuff is pretty, if you are a person who thinks about these issues, it's kind of obvious. And I think I sometimes take for granted that other people may not be thinking about it. And so trusting my instincts to point out something as simple as maybe that headline's not quite right, or maybe that use of the phrase could be different, or that photo sometimes requires me to remember that I actually do know what I'm talking about. So I guess my advice would be to listen to your instincts, and there's a gender lens to take on every subject.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope this won't be the last time.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope we can have you in Buenos Aires.
I would love that.
Sometime.
I would love that.
Thank you, Jessica.
Okay, take care.
Take care.